Hello, welcome to another museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW here on Long Island, and I am delighted to be joined all the way across the waves in France by Gillian Thomas. Hello, Jillian. Thanks for joining me.
Hello.
So normally the way we start out is I think it's really interesting for people to know about folks' background and sort of their experience, how they came to where they are now. So if you wouldn't mind, it'd be great if you could just talk a little bit about your background, and then we will launch into the main conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Well, I actually started off as a science teacher, but then I was really lucky to get a break and become a science advisor working for what's now Univers Sciences, as it was in its development period in France. And that was my first introduction to working on exhibits, working with architects and designers, none of whom I'd ever met before, and was a big eye-opener for me. So I went from being a science advisor, exhibit developer, to managing a whole space, managing a department, and then I next got a job setting up a children's museum in the UK, which was Eureka. And from there I went to the Science Museum in London to run an even bigger program of managing all their capital development, both buildings and exhibitions. And then I went down to Bristol and set up a science centre there for the millennium, for the year 2000. I acted after that as a consultant for a few years and worked in places like Trinidad, super exciting, briefly in Australia. So I've had a lot of experience at different places. And then for the longest period of time, I worked in Miami, getting what is now Frost Science off the ground from working in a small old museum. So it was a totally new experience for me because it was an old 50-year-old, quite small museum, and I'd never worked in a really small place before. So I've been so lucky to have this kind of diversity of experience in different countries, different types of organizations, different sizes of organizations, and I've loved every bit of the different jobs I've done.
Well, that's great. Well, your varied experience, both in different types of museums and numbers of museums and places all around the world will be a great way to segue into this conversation. And just for the folks watching this, so in full reveal here, so Jillian and I have been working with colleagues, and we've been thinking about sessions at conferences, which of course aren't happening now for lots of reasons. And we landed on the topic of mitigating messiness, which I thought was just a great title, but also relates to the idea of how, from an administrator or director's standpoint, some things that might be frustrations or difficulties or challenges in terms of working with creative people, and vice versa, from a creative person's standpoint, what might be some challenges or difficulties or frustrations working with administrators or directors. And so I thought, well, we can't let this good idea go to waste. So Jillian kindly agreed to sort of play around with that as our conversational starting point here. And so Jillian, with that preamble, maybe you could share some thoughts with your experience in different places as a director and an administrator about that topic.
Yeah, I should say Vicky Cave came up with the topic title, Mitigating Messiness, but it's a really great topic. I wanted to just share two brief stories from very early on in my career. So like one of the first times I tried to work with an artist was when I was at La Villette, and I was a new manager, so the whole thing was new for me. And a few months post-opening, it's near the end of the first year, and I get told by somebody that if you don't spend your budget, you won't get it next year. So I have to spend my budget, right? And there's an empty space, and I've got colleagues who are really keen on art, and so I think, oh, that's okay, we'll do something, I can get it done by the end of the year, money will go. So the brief was they had to use recycled materials. It was celebrating the holidays and kind of get on with it, right? And I have to say, I entirely left them up to it. And a few weeks later, this mysterious brown paper parcel appeared, which was about 3 to 4 meters cube, brown paper all over it. And it had 2 or 3 little bits of it, which were in sort of translucent paper, right? So that it looked like you could see inside, only you couldn't. And I was waiting for this moment of reveal and thought we'd have an event and everything. So I said, like, so what should we do for the event when we look what's inside? And the answer was, there wasn't anything inside. That was the art piece. My only lucky bit out of this is nobody ever asked me about why I spent so much money on a brown paper parcel. So that taught me that you need to be a little bit more specific about what you are asking for, and for the artist and for yourself, and to sort of know what it is you're getting yourself into before you go. My second topic's a different one. So this is when I'm at Eureka, and we had a wind generator on the roof, and somebody had this great idea that if you could get all the blades of the wind generator painted like a Newton's circle, when the blade went round, it should go white, and that would be great, right? So we found this artist that was going to do this for us somewhere in the depths of Wales, which was quite a long way away. And, you know, he seemed to be doing it, and it seemed to be coming along, and everything was great. And we had the day when it was going to be delivered, and a big crane to winched up onto the roof. And he hadn't made the wind generator, we'd given him it. He just had to paint the blades, right? And then I got this phone call, and they said, well, we're on the motorway on the way, but we've run out of petrol, and we don't have any money. Can you help us? And the answer is, I have absolutely no idea how to do this one, right? Other than get somebody to drive 3 hours to do it. So they did find some other solution, and they did eventually arrive late, but I had to pay for an extra day of crane. So that also made me realize how precarious many young artists in particular lives are, and that it's no good just expecting people to fit into some framework, which seems perfectly reasonable to you, when it actually probably doesn't work for them. So the sort of the framework and the money and how you pay people, all those things are really, really important. So those messages have stayed with me for all the other different projects that I've worked on. And the only other thing is, I think, was particularly on buildings with architects, you really need to understand and buy into what the concept is. Because unless you love the concept too, you'll end up cutting bits out that the artist or architect or designer loves, and you kind of spoil the whole thing between you. So I think that really understanding and loving what they're doing is a really important component of a successful working relationship.
So, well, those are great stories, especially the one about the people running out of petrol on the way to the job and not having the money to buy. But it's interesting. I mean, of the 3 things that you mentioned, I think, to me, there's a common thread of this need for clear and respectful communication between everyone. And I think a lot of projects or a lot of misunderstandings, and maybe like each of the examples you gave, are often a result of this sort of lack of communication or miscommunication or misunderstanding in different ways. And so from your perspective, maybe what are things that you've thought about over the years, or approaches that you've taken to sort of keep those lines of communication and sort of respect between the parties open, so that you sort of mitigate messiness, you avert those potential disasters? It's just interesting from your perspective, what might be takeaways, like, for people watching, that they could really think about or watch out for?
So one of the challenges is it depends on what kind of organization you're in. And there's a big difference between like a national museum and a smaller organization of some kind that can be more nimble and flexible. So just something as simple as being quite clear about what you want. You may well run into like the 30-page standard document that you have to have attached to all contracts, right? And for a new artist who's not worked with this kind of organization before, this is totally baffling and horrible. And, you know, I do think a good executive summary and what you really want right at the beginning in a one-page statement sounds nothing, but is actually really important for that kind of thing. And you can also run into real administrative difficulties with big organizations of things like a requirement for insurance. 5 million liability insurance, let's say, standard. The finance people would say, why haven't they got it? How can they be working and not have that kind of thing? So you have to find ways around all those different things. So if you're talking about a big organization, ways around it include you providing the insurance as part of the thing that you offer. That's one option. Another is they can maybe work part-time as an employee in a contract for a short time to get it to work out. Or you can find for them somebody for whom they can be a subcontractor who can do it, which of course means a bit more cost to the main organization. But there are all sort of ways around the administrative. You should never be defeated by the administrative. But again, you need a really helpful and friendly project manager that wants to find the ways and enjoys finding the ways around administration, as opposed to getting mad, which is what I do, right? Doesn't help.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think maybe from both of our experiences, since we've worked in different types of museums and in different places, I always think that if a museum or an organization wants to make something happen, they really find the way to make it happen. And if they don't really want to make it happen, somehow, no matter how, it just will never happen. So I think, especially as it relates to, those obvious kinds of things, the legalistic stuff about contracts and liability insurance. Yeah, absolutely. That those are things that, from the organization standpoint, are important and legitimate. But I'll just say, some of those contracts I signed from Miami were pretty long contracts, but there was an executive summary at the beginning too, which I think mitigated that. So.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to hear that.
And
the other aspect is that you need to know the circumstances of the person you're working with and be understanding of that. And many people that are artists and designers live on a very kind of hand-to-mouth, one contract to the next, one bit of money to the next. So they won't have money to put up for materials at the start very often. They may not even have a workshop space. There'll be all sorts of complications, and they may also be totally unrealistic about what they can deliver within a budget. So I'm sorry, this sounds really boring, but having a very large contingency that you can dip into when you want.
Well, that component. For sure. Although now, just to flip that around a little bit, from the creative side, because I think, and this sort of what you just mentioned is maybe a good segue into that, because artists and creative people are often thinking about things in a different way than inherently an organizational structure or an organization that's been around, museums for over 100 years or that, and that, that's not like that. So I know one thing from my standpoint as a creative person that is often frustrating is with the awareness that the institution wants to feel secure and protected, and obviously its money is being well spent, which are all legitimate concerns. But how do you keep those concerns from veering into what I would characterize as a feeling of being micromanaged as a creative person? So it'd just be interesting for you to comment on that, because I wrote down like, well, what are the things that if I have difficulties in a project that are difficulties, and I would say from myself and also talking with creative peers, the feeling of, well, why did you hire me if you're just going to micromanage every part of the process? So it'd be interesting to hear you respond to that.
Okay, so I think there's two things come in there actually, and they're different. So one is the organization often has a strong content focus, and you may be dealing with somebody that has the content as the thing that they really, really want to talk about, right? And that's their knowledge base, and that's what they're comfortable about. And they're probably not the best interface with the artist. I mean, because they will care desperately about it, and they won't be so willing to allow some kind of flexibility. So again, I think getting the right person in between as the intermediary that can make it happen is really, really important. I think also the knowing the artist and what it is they want to convey. I mean, you've selected the artist, and you should be able to know what they want to convey, and then you should be able to agree on some fairly broad timeline scopes so that you know what's going to happen. I think it's unwise to expect people, especially if you want a stage payment, to wait right until the end before you send anything in, right? But I think having some agreed but quite simple things that you have in between could help. I mean, it can be very complicated. So I had one semi-disaster with a design company where they kept telling me they had workshops around town and it was all somewhere else. And they kept sending, I go somewhere and I show something. And they said, oh, no, that bit's over at the other place, you know. I have to say, and then they stopped delivering the stuff and then went bankrupt and I didn't get the exhibit. But total disaster.
Well, that sounds like the exhibit version of a shell game. I mean, you know, well, no, it's not over here, it's over there. No, really, it's over here. So, yeah, I don't.
Now, you know, because you can send photographs and things, provided they are doing some work and they can send photographs, it can make people happy. So from the artist side, I would say saying, hey, you know, I found this little bit of something, or I did this cute drawing over here. Even if you don't have to send stuff, sending something that makes them feel that everything is going along and something's happening is important.
And I think that's another way of keeping the communication channels open. Yeah. You know, that the client can feel like progress is being made, forward progress is being made. Here are some interesting things that are happening, and not just like, well, what's happening? We don't know what's happening. You know, is this going to happen on time? Are these people going to deliver? I mean, again, those are, I think also, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that this, I stress respectful communication. Yes. And I think really there has to be a mutual respect between the parties, because I could not be a director, you know, but there are things a director has to be responsible for that are different than what a creative person has to be responsible for, and vice versa. And, you know, if you are looking at every action as a adversarial or putting a roadblock in your way kind of thing, that just seems like it's doomed. You know, it's not a real creative partnership. It's just this adversarial relationship, which
that's no good. But it's very important for the creative person to understand, whoever it is that is their manager, what their stresses are, right? So like if they have a once a month report they've got to make sure you said something that they can include in that report. And, you know, some little thing that they can think, oh, thank goodness that's come in. That's really helping me with my difficult, their over manager, which often happens in these big organizations. So I think trying to help the person and see it from their point of view as well as they should need to help see it from the creative person's point of view. It can be less formal, but it needs to be informative. I think that's the important point.
Well, and like you mentioned earlier, even something like some process photographs.
Yes.
If you got that, even if you had to add a sentence or two of description, that's something that you could legitimately put in a report to show that progress is being made. So.
Yeah, or 3 kids came into your workshop and really, really, really liked something, right? You know, that's a good story.
Right. And it gives you something to latch onto to meet your requirements and your situation. So
away from the money.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I often think about, and maybe it does tie back into this notion of respect and communication, is that there is often a mutual desire for both the institution and the client and the creative person to do something different, to do something that pushes the envelope a little bit.
That's right.
And that is not just, oh, we've seen this at 10 other museums, or you've done this 10 times before exactly the way. So I think that is both exciting and daunting at the same time, to say we want to do something that's really different than other museums have done,
Yeah.
and we really want to push the envelope on that. So how do you sort of find the balance there in terms of a project manager or a director or an administrator, to find the balance between exciting and daunting, while you are legitimately, from both sides, the creative side and the institutional side, saying we really want to do something a little different here, and something that is really pushing the field forward?
Yeah, well, you have to accept the fact that maybe it won't work.
Now this is why from my perceptions, the best directors are people who have had to put exhibits together or put programs together. So the fact that you were a teacher and the fact that you had to put exhibits together, from my perspective, of course, which is a biased perspective, says this is what makes a good director, somebody who actually can appreciate like what a person who's working on the floor, or an educator, or an exhibit developer, or an exhibit maintenance person is going to actually have to deal with, and not just sort of say, oh, sure, we'll just launch this crazy thing and you all take care of it now.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, things don't work, do they? So I think you need to kind of have some systematic way of piloting some things. It was a great idea. If it's a complicated thing, making sure it is what the audience is interested in, not just what your director is interested in, and trying as much as you can it out technically, and also knowing that it will need some tweaks once you've got it. It's not going to be perfect first time round. Definitely not if it's something that you haven't done before. I mean, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. And actually, funny thing is, sometimes it really doesn't work. So one of the ones I worked on, I was at the Science Museum, was some new technology that was coming out, that we had a partnership with one of the big companies, and they wanted us to demonstrate it, right? So you'd think you had something you could just like relax about, because it's a big IT company and you're going to demonstrate this, and no, it doesn't really work in this context, right? So
they allowed you to be the public guinea pigs for their bleeding edge technology, and then oh well.
Never mind, it was a good try, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think, and sometimes things work sort of, but not the way you thought they would work, right? But sometimes they work differently, and sometimes the public really likes some other aspect of it that you hadn't thought of. So I think if you're going into something that hasn't been done before, it's like making the process slow, because it's not going to be fast, having plenty of spare contingency, but above all, doing some kind of pilot to find out, A, technically how it could work, and B, whether the audience really likes it.
Well, I think, obviously, I think that's a great attitude that every director should share in a creative project. I mean, it just takes a lot of the pressure off everyone. You know, if things are wound so tightly, and it's like, hey, this better work, and it better work exactly the way you said it's going to work, and you feel like the guillotine is hanging over you if it doesn't. That is not. That doesn't, I don't know about you, but that doesn't make me feel more relaxed and creative. But
well, there's always something you can do, Paul. So I had one thing where something went totally wrong and the exhibits weren't delivered, and it was in France. It's a long time ago. And what did we do for the opening, which could not be delayed because the minister was coming? We put on a very large buffet, which covered all the floor space.
Well, if there's enough wine and good food in France, everybody's happy. Forget what exhibit. What exhibit? We'll come back next time for that. Well, Jillian, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I think everything we discussed has a little nugget of value for people as they're thinking about how to foster more positive creative
Yeah.
partnerships and really true. I mean, I always think of them as creative partnerships
Yeah, they
because
have to
there
be.
are stresses on the institution side and there are stresses on the creative side. And if
Yeah.
both sides aren't supportive of each other, it's really never going to work. I mean,
It's
it's
not going to
just
work.
not.
No,
So,
no, it isn't. Yes, it's
well,
not decoration creativity, right? It's not
well,
something
I don't think
you
so.
feel
Although
you throw
some
it
people,
outside. It's something
some
much more fundamental.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. You know, it's not just picking laminate colors or
that's right. Yeah,
new flooring options. Those are important things, but that's not the only thing. So,
yeah, yeah.
well,
Good.
terrific. Well, best to you there in
Thank you.
France, and
Speak
I
to you
hope.
soon.
Yeah, thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.